Faithful Exiles is a podcast that explores life following Jesus Christ in South Africa. We want to think deeply about what the Bible has to say about life and talk about what that might mean in the situations God has placed us in. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are not necessarily those held by the host, co-host, or production team. As this is a discussion and not a pure teaching platform, it is up to the listener to engage with the content responsibly.
Oh, hi there, and welcome to another episode of Faithful Exiles, the podcast that explores what a life of faith in and faithfulness to Jesus Christ might look like, especially in our South African context. And this morning, what we're thinking about is a subject which I think just about everybody recognizes is a huge need in our country, and yet which I think we as a church, although there are lots of encouraging signs and lots of rich history, really need to do more thinking about. And that's the subject of education, particularly early childhood education in those very formative young years. It's a great privilege to have with us today on the show Renier Coetzee. Renier is the founder of Trinity Children's Center on Mitchell's Plain, which started back in 2012, and he's spent years thinking about the problem of education in our country, and particularly God's calling on individual believers, on the church, to get involved. So Renier, it's great to have you with us today. It's great to be here, and we're looking forward to hearing from you on the subject. Perhaps we can begin, Renier, just hearing a little bit about your own story. I remember first meeting you maybe about 10 years ago or more now, and I noticed already then a passion for children. I think at that stage you'd been a Christian for a number of years already. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how that passion for children and for education grew in your own life.
Yes, I guess my passion for children feels incidental from my point of view, although I guess in God's providence, that's probably not the case. When I was in high school, so I only became a Christian in university. So when I was in high school, I wasn't Christian, nowhere near. But I was looking to earn some money. And in the school newspaper, there was an ad for entertainers for kids' birthday parties that paid 80 Rand an hour, which when was that, 2005, was a pretty decent amount for a high school job. So in high school, I did kids' birthday parties, balloon animals, face painting, dressed up as Spider-Man, etc. Fast forward a couple of years, I became a Christian in first year of university, being involved in church, looking for something, I guess, to get involved in, a ministry to get involved in, having no background, no experience. Kids ministry sort of came up as something that, having done a little bit of work with kids, at least entertaining kids, I thought maybe that's something where I can contribute something. So I could entertain the kids while the other people teach them. And so we started doing Sunday school, holiday clubs, Friday afternoon programs, sort of outreach programs. Over time, I guess that grew and grew to a more central place sort of in my life. After university, I had planned on a corporate career, but decided to sort of take a bit of time out to do a ministry apprenticeship and sort of just explore, I guess, whether there's some role for me in ministry, particularly children's ministry. And then that in the end turned into starting Trinity Children's Center as my view of what ministry looks like became broader than just sort of Bible club on a Friday afternoon, to doing something more holistic, and maybe these are things we'll talk about, but to look at the person as a whole, to look at the child as a whole, and say what does it look like to serve children, walk alongside children in a more holistic way. Not planned at all from my side, but
okay. God's providence had led in that direction. Well, maybe you can share a little bit of that history. So back in 2012, you say you started Trinity Children's Center, started as an ECD, right? Early Childhood Development Center. And if I understand correctly, this year, 2021, you'll have your first grade 7 graduating class, so added a year each year. Maybe just share a little bit of that history with us so we can know what have been some of the challenges along the way.
Yeah, to go a little bit back, we didn't start with the vision of a school per se. And when I say we, a friend and I were grappling with, I guess, questions of what God is doing in the world, what that looks like to partner with what God is doing, particularly in reaching children in vulnerable places, difficult places. And we started looking around at what other people were doing. So we, both in Cape Town and around the country, we took some time to go and visit other ministries. And that included all sorts, orphanages, clinics, children's villages, shelters. It included some schools, just a variety of different sort of ministries that were trying to serve children one way or another. And I think we learned a couple of things from that. And I'd certainly say to anyone who is thinking about the future and thinking about what they want to go and do, going to see things sort of in person is an incredible experience. We read lots of books before that and we'd done research before that, but it wasn't the same thing as actually going to see the real thing and interacting with the people who had started or were running those various ministries and getting a real sense of what it is on the ground. So that was an incredibly kind of formative experience, I think, for both of us. And some of the lessons we took away from that was the value of doing something long term. So we were working with the same people for a long time, I mean, we'll get to this, but that's a big part of education, is the opportunity to work with the same people for a long time. The value of being holistic, so being able to look at different facets of a person and be involved in multiple aspects of their life. And then finally, doing something that's developmental, so something that takes someone forward. It doesn't just meet a need in the moment, but it helps that person progress in their sort of journey and their development. And really, a school wraps all of those things together. So it's the kind of platform where you can, so in our case with Trinity, we wanted to do preschool and primary school, which gives us a space of 9-10 years that a child will be with us. So from the time they're kind of 3-4 years old to the time they're in grade 7, that's a long period of time to work not just with their child, but with their family, and where they're coming to us 5 days a week. So we're seeing them 40 hours a week for 10 years. That's long contact time to go on a journey with the child. And the opportunity to certainly be developmental. So it's not just what do you need in the moment, but how do we look at you growing in maturity, growing in skill, whatever else. But really opportunity to also be holistic. So it's meals can come with that. And so we provide meals, cooked meals at the school. Sort of family work can go with that. So not just developing the child, but saying how do we help their family move forward, whatever their needs might be. Sport, various other things. There's a saying in education, a child's not a brain on a stick. So it's not just teaching in the sense of academics, but really trying to develop the whole person. I think that's a uniquely Christian contribution to the kind of field of education. Maybe that's been lost a little bit recently, but certainly in generations past, this view of formative, sort of this formative process of how a person develops. I think Christians have something unique to do to contribute there in terms of kind of a holistic understanding of what it means to be a human being. That often, it's easy to get lost in education. But all of those things together, I think, made us say, we think a school could be a really powerful vehicle, platform for reaching children, for walking alongside children, and especially children in hard places where a lot of where the odds are really stacked against them from early on. We realized that, I should say we didn't realize quite what it takes to start a school and everything that goes into that. I think we had this vision of what it could achieve without fully understanding the cost of getting there. That is where the vision began, and through lots of ups and downs and back and forth, we over the last 10 years sort of went on that journey. So we started preschool back in 2012. Those kids who were in the preschool in 2012, many of them are now graduating in grade 7 at the end of this year in a few months' time. Or at least they think they are. I might fail the whole class just to keep them back for another year. We'll see. But no, it's been a journey of going up one grade at a time with them, sort of developing the school alongside the children over the last 10 years, and hopefully being able to serve many more generations of children to come. So as those kids have gone up, naturally new kids come into the preschool every year, and so we have 135 kids at school now.
That's a good overview. Maybe you can just share with us, so what does a typical day look like, I suppose, for a young person coming to Trinity Children's Centre? What time they arrive in the morning? What does that typical day look like? Just give us a flavour for it.
It's changed a little bit under sort of pandemic conditions. There are a lot of restrictions on what we can and can't do. But nevertheless, the kids would arrive between sort of 7:30 and 8. In the past, we used to have sort of communal breakfast, so the kids would all sit together in the hall and eat breakfast. We're not allowed to do that right now, but I'm sure in due course we'll go back to that. They will spend the majority of their time in a classroom with their teacher, and so we have 15 kids in a class. That's very intentional to have a small class. We're trying to do something that's highly relational, and so where the teacher is able to spend a lot of sort of contact time with children. And for the most part, they don't swap classes. They're with the same teacher the whole day, and that again is intentional, so that there is that opportunity to build that relationship, that sort of mentoring relationship.
That's true across the grades as well?
Yeah, so when they get to the final few grades, we do start doing a little bit of swapping just to get them used to it, because in high school that's obviously very common. So we do try and make them a bit more used to it in the final few grades, but for the most part, we try and keep sort of a high amount of contact with the same teacher throughout the year, so that they can have that relationship. They do spend obviously time with other adults. We're intentionally a small school because of, again, that sort of relational safety that creates. So it's 135 kids plus, I think, about 16 staff members. So it's about 150 people total in this little school community. And that means that a child can know the name and the face of everyone that they see the whole day. And what that creates is a sense of familiarity, a sense of community, a sense of, I know the people around me, I'm safe here. That's really important to us, compared to being in a campus of 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever the case may be. So there's a school across the road from us that's nearly 2,000 children in public school. And I think that's a very different experience. So it's very communal, very relational. The kids will they'll spend a lot of their time in class doing normal school things, math and English and everything else. We do Bible as well. So it is an explicitly Christian school, but it's not limited to Christian students. So anyone can enroll, anyone can come, regardless of religious background. But it is explicitly Christian in the sense we teach the Bible, teach the kids to pray. We try to integrate sort of Christian worldview into sort of what we teach, into history, into social science, etc. Pre-pandemic, there was a bit more opportunity to do sport and other things like chess and so on. Currently, again, there's some restrictions on what we're allowed to do at the moment, but we try to look at how the development is, like I said, not just the brain on the stick, how the kids are getting kind of a broad developmental exposure. And then something that I think is fairly unique to, I guess, our model is that we try and have high family involvement. So we have a lot of parent volunteers. So on any given day, there could be 5, 10 parents sort of in the school, busy doing different things, involved in the school. And that's important to us. Again, almost all of our kids are within walking distance of our campus. And so that again was an intentional thing. When we do our admissions, we look for kids who are close by because we want to have that sense of community, that sense of sort of parents being able to come to the school, be involved in the school. And we have a couple of people on our team who's specifically focused on the parents and not the children. So getting to know them, being able to disciple them, being able to come alongside them with whatever they might need. And so sort of big element of that. We've had the benefit of having a play therapist on staff. So some of the kids who have needed it are able to get a certain amount of intervention even during the day at school, to be able to do some play therapy, to be able to do, we have a trauma care specialist who also does sessions either with individuals or small groups, depending on what the need is. So day will really vary between different kids, but it's a lot of what you would expect in a normal school setting. It is a school. It's not something wildly unusual, but we've tried to put our sort of unique spin on that by sort of adding some of the things that we think make a big difference to the child's journey kind of through that 9-10 years that they're with us. And then next year, some of our kids will go to high school, and we'll have to see. Our hope is that some of them will be able to come back to us in the afternoon. So we don't offer high school. We end at grade 7. But the hope is that once they're off to high school, they're able to come back maybe in the afternoons, do some homework with us, or do some mentoring with us, or you have some kind of contact with us. So once all the primary school kids have cleared out and the building's empty and there's space, we hope for the high school kids to come back and keep that relationship going. Since they all, regardless of what school they go to, they all live close to us. Yeah. And so the hope is that we can keep that sort of alumni sort of connection going, which will be a big priority next year.
Yeah, that's exciting. So you've spoken about some of the unknowns and some of the costs. Obviously, lots of paperwork to get a school going, lots of administration. Of course, funding is also a real issue as well. Maybe you can just share a little bit, how God has provided for Trinity Children's Centre over the years. Do you have a link with the Western Cape Education Department? Is it largely personal donors? How's this work keep going?
We have an unusual funding model. So schools, typically, independent schools would run on fees. So the parents pay a fee that covers broadly the cost of the school. We've not done that. So we are a donor-based school, which means 92% of our funding is through private donors. So either individuals, businesses, trusts that give. The majority of those are South African. We do have some overseas funding as well, but largely South African Christians who resonate with what we're doing, want to be a part of that and donate to that. So that's the vast majority of our funding. We do charge a fee. So we charge sort of on a sliding scale, so from sort of 0 to 400 Rand a month, depending on the family circumstances. But that makes up a relatively small fraction, maybe 8% of our overall income. We are registered with the education department, but we're not we don't receive subsidy from them. So we're not funded by government at all. So it's mainly private funding. So we are a registered non-profit public benefit organization. So there's a certain tax benefit potentially for both individuals or businesses to give to us. So we've gone that route of being very heavily donor funded for a number of reasons. The primary reason being we want the school to be accessible to anyone sort of in that community. So we're in Mitchells Plain in Eastridge, which is generally a pretty low income sort of setting where folks don't have a lot of income, where private schools, independent schools don't exist because it's not affordable. And so the reason it's donor funded is so that it can be accessible to basically anyone. So even a parent who can't afford anything at all, maybe someone who's unemployed, can volunteer instead. And so that fee that they would normally pay, they can make up in volunteer hours instead, which a lot of people do. But that is incredibly challenging to sustain, not just building the school in terms of buildings, classrooms, the expansion of the school, but then also the actual monthly operations of the school. So our annual budget is, I think, probably about 3.5 million Rand. So we need to raise that every year in addition to whatever we need to raise to build buildings, classrooms, everything else. So it's a substantial amount of fundraising, more than one would think.
Lots of time, depending on the Lord, to provide. Maybe you can share just some joys and challenges. I'm sure these revolve around people. Maybe a story or two as well of the way you've seen people grow. They've been with you now nearly 10 years. These children. Some joys and some challenges working with children in this particular context with big social problems.
I think the joys. There's a vertical aspect and a sort of horizontal aspect. So I think the sort of vertical aspect, by which I mean sort of seeing God at work, is probably the most. I don't know if joyful is even the word, but it's an incredible thing to see God show up in those sort of moments of just not knowing what the next step is, where to go, what to do, where the resources are going to come from, and see time and again sort of God show up and give what's needed and sort of make a way where you didn't think there was one, in all kinds of ways. So that includes funding, but in many things, in trying to make a difficult decision, just not knowing what do we do, this is so complicated, what's the next step, and for God to give wisdom, or you're trying to find that next teacher, sort of the right person to join the team, and for that person to be provided, or we came at a point maybe 4 years ago where we had been sort of developing our little campus. We had a small little space. There was a bunch of houses that we had sort of put together, but we were just completely out of space and didn't know what to do next. And the kids were about to go to the next grade. We didn't have space for them. And then another property came onto the market close by, old community centre. It was pretty run down, but it was bigger than what we had. But the folks were asking a fortune for it, 4 million Rand for it, which we didn't have. We didn't have a cent. But we went to go look at it and say, oh, okay, this place is really great, but we'd love to have it. It would give us the space to kind of expand up to grade 7, but we can't afford it. I guess I won't go into all the detail, but we went back and forth with these folks saying, well, maybe we can offer them something lower. So they want 4, so we offered them 2. They thought that was a joke and not a very funny one. But we went kind of back and forth with them. The whole thing fell flat. We got to, what was this? Probably about August of 2017. So we had 3 months left to figure out at that point we were at grade 3, we needed to go to grade 4. So we had these kids for, I think, 6 years at that point, and we were potentially facing the decision of saying, well, you've been with us 6 years, you've reached grade 3, and now we can't go further because we have no space. But then end of August that year, we got a call back saying, you know what, we thought about that offer you made, and we'd actually like to take you up on it. The sort of cheeky offer we had made before. And long story short, they accepted the offer. We were able to get transfer of the property at the end of November 2017. So we had like 2 weeks to clean it up, renovate it, move in. To be able to afford it, we had to sell everything that we had before. We had to sell our previous campus completely. We had to sell everything to be able to buy this other place. So in the space of 2 or 3 weeks, we got a builder in there, sort of cleaned it up, fixed it was broken windows. The place was run down, broken windows everywhere. Water pipes weren't working, electricity wasn't working. Like there were all sorts of issues. We got guys in there, sort of cleaning up, fixing it up. We've got a bunch of volunteers from East Mountain, based here in Stellenbosch. They sent us a ton of volunteers. We packed up everything we had, and in essentially one day we packed, got in the truck. This truck went up and down like 7 times, getting all our stuff over, moved in, and started the new school year in this new building that. A couple of months before that, we was not on the table at all. Wow. So there were things like that, just these kind of divine interventions in many big and small ways. But then in the horizontal aspect, it's exactly what you expect. It's seeing the journey that children are on. So seeing a child who joins us at 3 or 4 or 5, and seeing the many ups and downs, like any person, like any of us. Although often experienced at a much younger age, maybe than some of us have, big challenges at a relatively early stage of life sometimes. So death of a parent, or gun violence in the community, or just not being screened from some of the difficulties of life that certainly I would have been screened from at that age. So seeing children grapple with really hard things, but then being able to walk alongside them, helping them sort of work through those things, and seeing the maturity that comes out the other side of that as the child thinks through very difficult things, grapples with difficult experiences, but does that in a community with mature Christian believers around them. And I'd say not all the kids who come to us are actually coming from a Christian home, but they're entering into a sort of community of faith that is trying to intentionally help them work through, think through kind of life and the difficulties of life from that perspective. And so you see the effects of that in children over time, how they wrestle through these hard things. I guess kind of the Romans 5 sort of thing of sort of difficulty leading to character, and you see what is now a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, and you can see the fruit of some of that work over the space of how many of years that they've been with us. So seeing children who maybe we struggled with depression or all sort of things related to that. I mean, those things sometimes look a little bit different in younger children, but seeing kids come through really dark times and come out the other side of that.
Lack of motivation.
Yeah, exactly. Or coming through with issues of sort of anger or aggression. A lot of that kind of fight or flight sort of stuff where they've had sort of a traumatic experience or ongoing, people talk about continuous trauma, just continuously difficult experience. And there can be, there's a range of different ways the kids respond to that. Some can really withdraw, some can become really aggressive, some can become, just the big jokers where everything's just a joke, as kind of a way of coping with those things. And so helping those kids find new, healthier ways of kind of processing, dealing with things that allow them to kind of become the people that, that they have the potential to be. A lot of that is, I think what's striking to me is a lot of it's not like it is in the movies where it's, there's a tough situation, and then there's kind of the conflict and the resolution, and then the happy ending. It's not as neat and tidy as that a lot of the time. It's much more of a continuous thing of wrestling, a bit of progress, a bit of growth, a bit of sometimes regress, going backwards, going forwards, going backwards, going forwards, and there's never this sort of clean, happy ending and now it's all done. It's a continuous story. And they're only, when they leave us, they're only 12, 13, so they've got the rest of their lives ahead of them.
Well, I think it's like you said, it's like how everybody's story in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. But nevertheless, one of the benefits of working with the same people for a long time is you do get to see that progression. And even though it's not this kind of neat, tidy movie plot, you do see growth and progression and ongoing struggle. But hopefully we've given them some of the tools to to wrestle with that, and we'll see when they get to high school. That'll be the test.
Yes, no, well, that's exciting. And well, let's think a little bit about some of the biblical theological foundations that you work from, some biblical themes, texts that have inspired you in this particular work. But maybe you can actually just begin by just saying, why should Christians be concerned about education in our country? I suppose it's a big question. Why should Christians have this concern about education?
Sure. I think there are a number of different avenues that can bring people to education. And certainly the people that I've spoken to or invest in education have come to it from different angles. You can care about education for education's sake. And I think that makes a lot of sense for Christians. We care about truth. We care about beauty. We care about I guess what people think and what they believe, and those things we believe that those things really matter. And so what's being taught, what's being learned should matter to us. It should matter to us whether what's being taught as true is really true, whether what's being taught as right is really right. So I think you can care about education for education's sake. And if you're in education, if you're a teacher, you should care about I guess at almost I want to say a philosophical level, a more technical level of the actual content and form and sort of approach to education. If you're not in education per se, maybe that's of less interest to you, but there's a whole realm that I think Christians have a lot of value to add in understanding what a human being is from a biblical perspective, and that affects the way that you think about education, about teaching, about development. So you can come to education for education's sake. I think you can come to education for children's sake, which is probably more the route I've come. So I didn't start out wanting to be involved in education. I started out caring about children, and that led me to education because that's a big part of a child's life. So they spend the majority of the time at home and at school. And so I think Christians, if we care about children, which we ought, so God described himself as a father to the fatherless. God cares about children, especially children in hard places. And so those two things should matter to us. What's happening at home and what's happening at school, because that's where kids are a lot of the time. And so we should care about things like child protection, things like foster care and adoption, about kids who don't have a functional home or functional family life. I think that's something we should care about immensely. And also kind of what's happening at school. So in those school communities, how are they being formed, how are they being shaped, what is the experience there? So those two things. And thirdly, I think you can care about education for society's sake. So if you think about the future of a society, education really matters. It matters about what the next generation, how they will think, how they'll kind of process the world around them, what their worldview will be. So I think those kind of different angles, and I think Christians have good reason for any of those reasons, or all of those reasons actually, to have an interest in education, whether at kind of a micro level, at a macro level, at differing levels. And rather tragically, I think South Africa's education system is in a lot of trouble. And it fills me with dread sometimes to think about, I guess, where we're going in terms of... There's some notable exceptions. There's some absolutely amazing schools and amazing teachers, and there's some absolutely incredible things happening, but they are the exception. And so I think for Christians in general, we should be heartbroken, I guess, about what... I think most of us, and I imagine most people listening to this, have had a reasonably decent education and probably cannot imagine the stuff that's happening in most of public education at the moment. And certainly for me, I went to public school as a kid, but what's happening now is not what was happening 20 or 30 years ago. A lot has changed, and I think people often don't realize quite the state. And as I say, there are exceptions, but on the whole, education's not in a good place. And it's heartbreaking to think of the children who are starting their education now, who have, in a sense, such difficult odds to overcome. I think that alone, that's what I guess inspired me to say I want to come alongside children and say, how do I walk some kind of a road alongside them, helping them to overcome sort of the odds that are very much stacked against them in a way that is hard to fully grasp until you've seen it. Just to talk about, I guess, a specific text that really led me to that is Isaiah 58, which perhaps is a familiar text to some. It talks about, it sort of begins with a description of sort of the people of Israel fasting and God not seeing them, not hearing them, and the sort of complaint about, why do we fast and you don't hear us? And God essentially, through Isaiah, says to them, well, you fast, but at the same time you oppress and you do wickedness, and he speaks to talk, I guess, about true fasting. Say this is the fast that I choose. To loose the bonds of wickedness, to set free the oppressed, to feed the hungry, to care for the homeless. Just this sort of rich description of coming alongside the oppressed and the needy, sharing with them, meeting their needs, setting them free. And intermixed with that, throughout that chapter, these promises of incredible intimacy with God. You will call and I will say, here I am. Sort of God speaking to his people. Your light will break forth, your bones will be made strong. So it's the sort of mix of a calling to care for the needy and a promise to be with you and to sort of answer your cries and to be near you and to make you strong and to your sort of light will rise in the darkness. And I wrestled with that. That text has been very influential for me over the last 10, 11, 12 years whenever I first grappled with it. Because I was trying to understand that. Well, how does that work? Why is there this partnership between intimacy with God and caring for the poor and the vulnerable? And I think it has a lot to do with who God is himself. So I said earlier, he talks about himself as the father to the fatherless, the protector of widows. There's something in, I think, God's nature to care for the vulnerable, the oppressed. And it's not as if he's sitting back and telling us to go. He's already there. He's already in those places. He's already in the hard places, walking alongside people. And so when we go there, we find him already there. And I guess that's been my experience with Trinity, is that as we've sort of gone into this challenging place, a place where it's hard to be a child, we found God already at work before we got there. And so we've sort of entered into something that he's already doing. And you do experience, I guess, that intimacy of seeing God at work in ways that you just couldn't have imagined. And that you have the opportunity to kind of step into. And so I think the invitation to Christians that I would offer is to say, God is already at work in big ways in the hard places, and the invitation to us is to go join him there, to go find him there, sort of in the thing that he's already doing. And so to see a side of him, of his faithfulness and of his power that you might otherwise miss out on.
So coming back to a comment that you made earlier that I found quite interesting was the idea of blending in the Christian worldview in the process of education, which of course is something that one would not find in a secular state-run context. So I would be very interested to hear from your side, where do you find the largest, I guess, deviation from the state model, like perhaps reflecting on certain subjects? So if I were to send my kid to a Christian school or a state school, something like mathematics would probably look quite similar in both contexts. But in what kind of fields or subjects would you say you find the largest deviation because of the Christian worldview being kind of introduced into the module?
Mm-hmm. So at the deepest level, I think the distinction often comes down to whether there's such a thing as absolute truth. So is there truth, or is it socially constructed, relative? And that's often not obvious when you kind of look at it from outside. So you look at the math, you look at the science curriculum, whatever else it is. You have to dig to really understand the difference between what would I teach and how would I teach if I believe there is such a thing as truth and goodness and beauty that is absolute, that is defined, versus if I believe truth, goodness, beauty are all kind of relative, subjective, socially constructed. And it's like a fork in the road that takes you on two very different paths. And you do see it expressed, I think, more strongly in the social sciences than maybe in something like a math or language. It has an impact everywhere, but in terms of what you're asking, yeah, I think the history, the science, the things that deal more directly, I guess, with questions of morality and so on, I think you'll see the difference more starkly. But I think that underlying difference between sort of a basis in the true, the good, and the beautiful versus the sort of the social contract and social construction, I think it'll show up everywhere. And it can be incredibly hard to, even just as an individual teacher within your classroom, to know, I guess, how to play those things out. But I think that's something for Christians to grapple with in a big way, and say, what is your worldview sort of based in kind of the story of God that gives an identity that is not choose who you want to be, whatever feels right is right. Your sort of an identity that's part of some bigger picture that has the significance and the meaning that comes with that. I think that's an incredibly empowering thing for children to say, yeah, actually, I'm part of something bigger. I don't have to make it all up. I don't have to just do the next thing that feels good. Or I think on the one hand, those sort of shallow promises of the kind of the subjective stuff. It kind of sounds nice. You can be whatever you want to be, and I don't know that, but I don't think it gives kids the real substance. I think I've seen a tendency, I think in many cases, to underestimate what kids are capable of intellectually and morally, and to feed kids just sawdust, so to speak, to give them really kind of watered down, just not the meat. And I think something that Christians can add to that table is to have a high view of children. Say these children are made in God's image, and they're young, but they're people. They're not going to be people when they're grown up. They're people now, and therefore they can grapple with big ideas, and they can grapple with ambiguity, and they can grapple with questions of right and wrong, and what is good and true. And I'd love to see more kids grappling with those big things, the things that can give your life shape and meaning, rather than just memorize the textbook, write the test, go on to the next thing, because it's going to get me a good job. One of the I guess, practical outworkings in education, when you don't have a grounding in the sort of what I want to call the deep things, questions of sort of life and meaning, is that it becomes very pragmatic. It's about what job you're going to get, and choose subjects that are going to lead to a good job, and that becomes kind of the justification for education is that it's preparing you for the working world, which is not untrue. Part of the reason you get an education is to be able to work, obviously, but if that becomes the basis for your education, that it's just about getting a job, it's treating people like machines. So I'm programming this machine to become an accountant when it grows up, as opposed to I'm developing a person in all the fullness of what that means, a person made in God's image.
Preparing them for life in a holistic way, not just for their future employment. Yeah.
I think what you're touching on now is kind of the question of what is the purpose of education, or the teleology really behind it, and how does that differ, in a Christian context versus a secular context. And like you point out, in a secular context, it often is the case. It's a very materialistic worldview, right? The purpose of education solely is so that I get a job, so that I'm comfortable, and so that I'm well off. And obviously everyone wants to be comfortable and well off, but as Christians, we're not primarily called to be comfortable and well off. There's the larger meta question of education under the lordship of Christ, and what does that look like in God's creational design of things, and the role that plays. Yeah, but that's probably a more complex topic. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Well, maybe just in short to say, your understanding of education will only be as good as your understanding of people, what a human being is. And I think it's true of all the social sciences. The richer your understanding of a human being, the richer your understanding will be of education and any other kind of social science, because it's all rooted in how we think about people. And I think that's where Christians really have something to add. We have a unique and rich and deep anthropology given to us in Scripture that asks a lot of big questions and gives us a way to answer some of those big questions. Whereas without that foundation, people don't want to ask the big questions because there are no answers. And so why ask these big questions of the purpose and everything else if you have no way of answering them, if it's all just pick what feels good to you.
Perhaps also just share a word with us, again, on the topic of the distinction between Christian education and secular education. The secularists tend to view education as some form of salvation. So they're still made in God's image, and so they can't help but realize the brokenness of the world. And so one of the solutions is, well, if people were just more educated, then that would solve the issue. As Christians, we obviously understand the importance and the necessity of education, but we understand that it ultimately will not uproot evil and sin in the world. So perhaps just share some wisdom or a few words with us about that distinction within the Christian context that you work in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we all live with sort of assumed stories, whether we're conscious of them or not. And so that sort of idea of education as salvation, education as sort of the thing that's going to save society, save people, there's a long history of that. That's nothing new. And that assumes a certain story that the problem is that people are ignorant, people don't have enough knowledge, and therefore the answer is that we give them knowledge, we teach them, and then the outcome is this new world where everyone's you're informed and educated, and therefore everything just works. And when you put it out like that, I think you can hear how silly that is. And that educated people can still be evil. And in fact, more effectively evil, I think C.S. Lewis would say, more educated devils. So you have to go back to that, I guess, creation, fall, redemption story as Christians say, well, what do I believe the problem is, the fundamental problem, as opposed to the secular person who might think that's ignorance or that's actually just economic development is the problem. Those are closely tied. So really the problem is there's not enough sort of economic development in the world, and education is a big part of economic development in people's minds. So what do I think the problem is? And that's going to affect what I think the solution is, and therefore how I kind of see the future unfold out of that solution. And so as a Christian, if you have a more holistic understanding of the fall, that it's this rebellion against God that has had influence over every aspect of life, including the mind, then I can begin to see where education fits in as a part of redemption, but not the central thing. So it's not that education is going to save me. We have this sort of understanding of the gospel and of Jesus being redemption, but now actually I can see how education can be a part of that bigger story. I can see how me being involved in education can be a part of what God is doing in the world in terms of creating a new heavens and new earth, this sort of progression towards restoration. And how my education is never going to be perfect. It's not my education, the education that I do, the school that I build is not going to be a perfect place. It's not going to solve all of the problems, but it can be sort of, in light of the bigger picture of what God's doing in the world, it can be valuable. It can make a real difference to people's lives. In some sense, counteracting. Yes, I think education can, in a sense. There's a saying, all truth is God's truth. And so whenever I come face to face with truth or goodness and beauty in whatever facet, there's something of God to be seen in that. And as a teacher, as an educator, the opportunity to help, whether that's in a good piece of literature, and it doesn't have to be Christian literature, just good literature, or as I'm engaging sort of nature through science, or as I'm engaging just some form of truth or goodness and beauty in whatever field I'm teaching in, there's an opportunity there, I think, for the heart to be shaped in response. I'm thinking of kind of the Romans 1 thing of when my heart comes into contact with goodness, truth, and beauty, I have, in a sense, a choice to say, this points to a creator, and I can worship him because of something that I see of him in that truth and goodness and beauty, or I can suppress that truth, and that leads to idolatry. And education's not going. If you're going in with the expectation that education's going to make everyone make the former choice and not the latter, you're going to be surprised. People can see truth, goodness, and beauty and still reject it. But I think if you can see education within that framework of kind of creation, fall, redemption, Creation Regained by Al Walters is really helpful in that sort of understanding. I think that gives you a way to see its worth without making it ultimate, without making it idol, without making it the thing, but still a thing. It's not useless. It's a worthy thing to do, but within the framework of something bigger.
Yeah, I think it comes back to what you said before about the question of anthropology and what does it mean to be human. That's going to inform what is wrong with humans, and that's going to inform what's the solution to our problems. And it reminds me of people like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, who would say, our morals are just rationally self-evident. So there's that almost issue of ignorance of people who are just more educated. But I think, thank you for that wisdom. That was something to chew on.
Well, let's wrap things up a little bit, thinking about some practical implications of this. So Christians who are maybe inspired, hearing the story of Trinity Children's Center or other Christian initiatives to be involved in education, might be thinking, well, how can I get involved? Maybe there's some Christian teachers listening, or maybe someone's just inspired to be involved in the lives of children. What advice, Renier, would you give to them? Maybe someone even thinking about starting a school in their area. Well, what advice to someone starting on this journey of being involved in education of young people, what advice would you give?
If you are, let's say, a Christian teacher looking to get into some form of Christian education or wanting to start a Christian school, anything like that, I think a good place to start is with getting into the network. So ACSI, the Association of Christian Schools International, has a South African chapter that is present, I think, in every province and some of our neighboring countries. So it is well worth your while if you thinking about anything along those lines to Google ACSI South Africa, Sean Moore is the director, and to have a conversation with them to say, I'm a Christian teacher, are there any Christian schools in my area that I could potentially work at? Or I'm a teaching student and I'm thinking about what to do next, or I want to start a school, whatever the case may be. Those are good folks to speak to. We belong to that network. And the reason that's important is it's a complex field to get into. There's a lot in education, there's a lot of layers to navigate and to understand. Legislative stuff, sort of compliance stuff, practical stuff, financial stuff. Obviously the philosophy of education, everything else. There are lots and lots of layers to schooling, more than people realize, I think. And so just being in a network of other people who are doing the same thing is really helpful. So I definitely say absolutely get in touch with ACSI, find out whether there are any other people in your city, in your province that are part of the network. Get in touch with them, visit. There's incredible value in just going to visit a place and seeing the people, meeting the people, having a conversation. You're reading a book, listening to a podcast. It's a good start, but actually going to see things in levende lijve, physically is a valuable thing. And certainly if you're thinking about starting something, I'm always hesitant to say this, there can be an incredible impact. It can be an incredibly worthy thing to do, but it's an incredibly challenging thing to do. And you don't know the half of it. When you're just thinking about it as a concept, you don't know the half of the problems that are coming. And so it is really valuable just to
have a reality check.
Yeah, to count the cost and say this is something that's worth doing, but it's not something that can be done casually. And I think what I've realized is the cost of doing it right is high in terms of financial investment, in terms of personal investment, everything else. It takes a lot to do it right, but the cost of doing it badly is even higher in terms of the impact you can have on children. So when people entrust you with their children, there comes a weight of responsibility there that is hard to describe. And the witness of the church potentially. So in our case, we work with the local church. That was one of our kind of founding principles. We wanted to work with the local church. If our school messes up, that affects the witness of that church and the church more generally. And so there comes a weight of responsibility when you take on something like this that I think one has to wrestle with. It's not a reason not to do it, but you want to do it with your eyes wide open and with support and with good advice. But if you're in the Western Cape, come and visit us. We'd love to show you around and you can sort of see some of the ins and outs of kind of what we've done, which is not the only way to do things.
Well, we'd certainly encourage that. We'll have details on the website of how people can get in touch with Trinity Children's Centre. And I know many people, you mentioned East Mountain earlier, who've really benefited from being involved and seeing it in person. Yes. Maybe finally, maybe some resources that you could recommend for Christians thinking in this area.
Sure. I actually brought my physical books with me. So for the folks watching, you can see the covers of these books I'm going to mention. So first one, Schools as Communities, edited by James Drexler. So this is, in my opinion, the best book I've seen on Christian education. There's contributions from a lot of different people in here, wide range of topics in the different chapters. This has shaped in quite a big way the way I think about school and what a school is. The title, Schools as Communities, I think says much of it, that school is a relational thing. It's a place where people, it's a learning community, a community of people together learning. And that's not the dominant frame of mind that I've experienced sort of in the education industry. That's not generally how people think about school as community. So I found this to be incredibly powerful. Some of the people who contributed to this book are professors of mine, just for full disclosure, people I've learned from sort of in a personal capacity. But yeah, Schools as Communities, I think this is on Kindle. I doubt you'll find it locally. It's a bit of a niche book, but it is on Kindle. So Schools Community by Drexler. Definitely worth reading. More generally, if you're just thinking about not education per se, but coming alongside People in Hard Places, then a book called When Helping Hurts, Corbett and Fickert. Also quite an influential book for me and for many people that I know in terms of how we think as Christians about coming alongside people in hard places and what that looks like from a Christian perspective. So those would be my top recommendations. Maybe one other book, I don't have a physical copy of it, I read it on Kindle, but The Beautiful Tree. So that's not a Christian book specifically, but it does speak to a different way of thinking about education, and particularly education among sort of poorer communities. I wish more people would read that book too, The Beautiful Tree. I forget the author, but I would look that up as well.
Well, Renier, thank you very much for being with us. We're greatly encouraged by the work that the Lord has been doing through you at Trinity Children's Centre, and excited about the next chapter as well. As the grade 7 students graduate this year, I do hope that you will pass them all and let them move on to the next chapter of life. But thank you very much for being with us today and listening to you and hearing from some of that wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.